Good day. Today is Monday, 16th February 2026. And before I proceed with this program, let me remind you to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. If once you've watched this video, you decide that you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate that fact. Now, tomorrow, the new negotiations, the next round of the negotiations between the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the Americans will take place in Geneva. But before discussing those, I'm going to make a quick roundup of the military situation because, as I have discussed in many places, many times, it is the military situation that is driving the diplomacy, not the other way round. And the last 24 hours, we have actually started to see faster movements on the battlefields and a clearer sign of the direction that events are taking. So let's first of all begin with a drone attack that Ukraine launched against Russia. This took place across western Russia. Towns like Belgorod and Bryansk were attacked. There were also attacks on facilities in southwestern Russia. Ukrainian commentators and some Western commentators have been talking up these drone attacks. A number of drones, Ukrainian drones, were also launched towards Moscow. I have been reading the Russian media, which does cover these drone attacks. They are reported there. But you would again find yourself in a completely different universe about these drone attacks than you do if you listen to the accounts of them from some commentators. I've said many times that these drone attacks are a pinprick that is perhaps understating things in some places. In Bryansk and Belgorod, which are located close to the Ukrainian border, they are a great deal worse than that. They are a major inconvenience, with those towns or parts of those towns affected by periodic losses of power. But if one is talking about Russia as a whole, these attacks, these drone attacks, these Ukrainian drone attacks, are an almost minimal affair. They do little damage, little permanent damage. We had all of those claims and reports back in the summer about the massive damage done to the Russian oil refineries. I said at the time that those claims were completely untrue, and that is today now almost entirely accepted. And Ukraine now seems to be trying to attack energy facilities. It's only able to do sporadic damage. And it is also attacking industrial facilities, which, by the way, are just about the most difficult targets for an aerial bombing campaign. They are industrial facilities, particularly in the former Soviet Union, are exceptionally strong. Machinery is extremely difficult to destroy, and that applies if you are using missiles and aerial bombs. Drones, which can only impact with a limited explosive force, are not going to do very much damage at all. And I read one report which said that the Ukrainians also tried to do damage to a 750 kilowatt electricity substation in western Russia. Again, this was a drone attack. Again, this is a very big facility. Recently, the Russians have begun to attack electricity substations across Ukraine. They've attacked some of them with Kinjal missiles. One particular such substation in western Ukraine was struck by apparently a Kh-12 22 missile. It was not capable of knocking the substation entirely out. Drone attacks, by contrast, by drones carrying limited amounts of explosive, are not going to do any significant or long-term damage. Now, Ukraine does know this, and they've developed or tried to develop various missiles. They were apparently working hard on a missile called, from memory, the Sun in the summer, but apparently the Russians from the air destroyed all the production lines and facilities. I understand that the Oreshnik attack on the Yuzhmash factory in Dnipro in November 2024 also destroyed a program, an ongoing program by Ukraine to develop powerful missiles. Most recently, the Ukrainians have talked up their new Flamingo missile, and we were recently shown film of some of these missiles being launched against targets in Russia. But Zelensky himself has now come forward saying that the production lines for these missiles were attacked and destroyed by the Russians, that there are only a small number of these missiles available, and he did appear to admit that the program overall has failed. There is an article in the German media which goes further than that. It says that the Flamingo missile is big and slow, that it is an easy target for the Russian air defense system, that the Russians have never had any real problems shooting these Flamingo missiles down, and that the entire program to develop and use this Flamingo missile to conduct attacks against Russia has been a failure. Incidentally, and it may not be a complete coincidence, that this has come out at the same time as the failure of the Flamingo missile. There's been a long article, not a very long article, there's been an article in Business Insider, a news outlet very, very hostile to Russia, which concedes rather grudgingly that over the last 4 years, the already formidable Russian air defense system has improved by orders of magnitude in competence, and now does indeed represent a significant challenge for NATO in the event of a Russia-NATO clash, which, let us hope, never comes. Anyway, I've discussed this Ukrainian drone attack because obviously this was one piece of news. It's been heavily covered in some places, but it makes little difference. What the Russians are doing is going to make an awful lot of difference. Firstly, all of the indications speak of a major Russian strike against Ukraine, perhaps this evening, using hypersonic missiles, other types of missiles, maybe Iskander ballistic missiles, lots and lots of drones, and perhaps, who knows, maybe even the Oreshnik as well. But there is a major Russian strike, everybody knows it, coming. It may happen as early as tonight. The Russian strategic bombers are again assembling in their bases, and it looks as if this is all indications of a major strike like that being prepared. But on the battlefronts, we're also getting now information. Firstly, over the last 24 hours, I noticed that news about Ukraine's Zaporozhye counter-offensive seems to have dwindled away. The Ukrainians still claim that it is underway, but we've not heard anything further about any Ukrainian successes. The Russians, by contrast, have a great deal to say about it. Firstly, we've had reports from the governor of Kherson region. This is, I should stress, the Russian-appointed governor of Kherson region, and he is Vladimir Saldo. Anyway, Saldo says that the Ukrainians have suffered significant defeats in Zaporozhye region, and they are responding to those by increasing attacks against civilians in Kherson region by way of some kind of compensation. Well, we can perhaps disregard the last part, but Saldo says, to repeat again, that the Ukrainian attacks in Zaporozhye region have been unsuccessful. The other person who's been speaking about this is our old friend Andrei Marochko, and he says that the Russians are successfully advancing west of Orekhov in Zaporozhye region and have successfully repelled all enemy counterattacks. And he went on to say, as for Orekhov, we see our troops developing their success. First of all, battle group Dnepr has liberated 3 communities since early February. All this happened on the western outskirts of Orekhov. The enemy tried to carry out several counterattacks, first of all in the area of Malaya Tokmachka, southeast of Orekhov. All of these attacks were unsuccessful. Capturing Orekhov is a key to capturing Zaporozhye city. Without the liberation of Orekhov, it is possible to advance on Zaporozhye city, but it is highly illogical and also dangerous. So this is what Marochko is saying. And I would add that Redovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, yesterday carried another further article saying that the Ukrainian counterattacks in Zaporozhye had been unsuccessful. I think this is almost certainly true. In fact, this morning there were reports that the Russians, in fact, have been making the advances in Zaporozhye region and that they continue to advance west of Gulyapolye, and that another important community or settlement has been captured by them there. But all of this is dwarfed by the news further north. It seems that in Konstantinovka, where I believe the major battle currently in the area of the special military operation is taking place, it seems that the Russians have achieved some kind of a breakthrough. The reports speak of the Russians having broken into Konstantinovka from the southwest. This is the major fortified area of Konstantinovka, and that of Russian troops, and this is not sabotage and reconnaissance troops, but actual proper infantry formations, now having reached the center of Konstantinovka as they have advanced from the southwest. And of course, this is the area where supposedly the Ukrainians have been having logistical problems because they have to cross a river which bisects Konstantinovka. Russian drones have been attacking the crossing points, the bridges, and there are claims that the Ukrainian troops in southwest Konstantinovka for some time now have been running short of supplies. If all of this is true, then, and I believe by the way that it is, then we are probably looking at the key moment in the Battle of Konstantinovka. Thereafter, I suspect that we're going to see a growing collapse. The Ukrainian supply routes into Konstantinovka are cut off by Russian drones. I doubt that the Ukrainians will be able to hold their positions in Konstantinovka for very much longer, and I repeat my view that Konstantinovka quite plausibly will fall before the end of this month. Now, if that is true, if that does indeed happen, then this is a major blow for the Ukrainians, coming shortly after the fall of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. It would mean that key cities in Donbas are falling. It would reduce the area of Ukrainian control to the two cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Other places like Druzhivka and Dobropilye, south and west of Konstantinovka, would likely fall quickly also. And of course, at that point, the crisis, the operational crisis of the Ukrainian army in Donbas will become impossible to conceal. So that is, in my opinion, the single most important event on the battlefields. Obviously, it has not played out just over the last 24 hours. Probably this Russian breakthrough has been happening for several days, maybe even weeks. The fact that we have not been getting information from Konstantinovka, as I have pointed out many times, is better understood as a sign that events in Konstantinovka were taking an increasingly fast pace, rather than the situation there had become stuck, and so it seems to be. Now, elsewhere, there are also Russian advances. There are reports that the Russians have captured an area of hills up to the west of Slavyansk, which is supposedly a key fortified line. There's also reports that the Russians are now attacking certain villages to the west of Liman, which does make one wonder about what the state of Ukrainian defenses in Liman actually is. But those things I'm going to discuss in more detail in future programs. The point is that it does look as if we are seeing the first signs that over the next few weeks the Battle of Konstantinovka is going to end, and that Konstantinovka is going to fall, and that will expose the full extent of Ukraine's operational crisis in Donbas. Now, all of this comes on the eve of a meeting of the negotiators from Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, who are gathering in Geneva and who are going to meet tomorrow. Now, the first thing to say is that it has now been confirmed that the venue, Geneva, was picked by the United States and indeed was insisted upon by them. The Russians weren't keen to go, and interestingly, it turns out neither were the Ukrainians. It is now all but admitted that the reason the Swiss foreign minister, Ignacio Cassis, went to Moscow a few days ago, breaking the taboo, by the way, on direct diplomatic contacts at this high level between Switzerland and Russia, that the reason Cassis went to Moscow was to persuade the Russians to agree to hold this meeting in Geneva rather than in Abu Dhabi or in some other place in the Middle East. And the reason the Americans wanted the meeting in Geneva tells you a great deal about the nature of US diplomacy at this time. This is that obviously the Americans at this meeting in Geneva are going to be represented again by the two twins, the two twin negotiators, if you like, Witkoff and Kushner. Witkoff, Trump's representative. Kushner holding no official position in the US administration, but, well, there he is. He is, after all, Trump's son-in-law. I suppose that's the reason. That's what gives him status. And the point is that even as Witkoff and Kushner tried to conduct this incredibly complex negotiation with the Russians and with the Ukrainians, and bear in mind that there are no better negotiators in the world at this level, or at least more thorough and formidable negotiators in the world at this level than the Russians, even as Witkoff and Kushner, two amateurs, no background or experience in international diplomacy, tried to conduct these negotiations with the Russians. They are simultaneously conducting negotiations with the Iranians as well. And it seems that there were objections in terms of the negotiations with Iran in holding them in Abu Dhabi, and the Iranians were not happy about holding them in Turkey. Some kind of deal was eventually done that the negotiations with the Iranians would take place in Geneva, and since Witkoff and Kushner have to shuttle from one set of incredibly complex and very demanding negotiations with some of the world's toughest and wiliest negotiators in Geneva, which is to say the Russians, to meet another set of the wiliest and most difficult negotiators in the world, which is the Iranians. Well, the decision was made to bring both the Iranians and the Russians to Geneva and to conduct the business there so that Witkoff and Kushner could shuttle between the two. I have to say, I find this absolutely zany. To me, the idea that you instruct two amateurs to conduct negotiations at this level with two such formidable interlocutors at one and the same time seems extraordinary. But this is how the administration, the Trump administration, goes about conducting its diplomatic business. Anyway, the Russians are going to Geneva and the Ukrainians are going to Geneva. And yesterday, I discussed the fact that the Russians have appointed Medinsky to head the delegation in Geneva. Now, over the last 24 hours, the Russians, Peskov to be precise, Putin's spokesman, have provided a significant amount of clarity. Firstly, they say that it is not the case that Medinsky is replacing Kostyukov. As far as the Russians are concerned, the negotiations in Geneva are a continuation of the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, which took place in Istanbul over the course of the summer. Those negotiations, the negotiations in Istanbul, which took place in the summer of last year, are, according to the Russians, an extension of the negotiations which also took place in Istanbul and before that in Belarus in February, March and early April 2022. Russia's chief negotiator in the 2022 and 2025 negotiations was Vladimir Medinsky. He was the chief negotiator. He's the person who's running the negotiations. He, therefore, has always been and remains the chief negotiator, the head of mission. And it is in that capacity that he's going to Geneva tomorrow. it's the Russians, as I say, are treating this as a resumption of the Istanbul talks. And Kostyakov, when he met the Ukrainians in Abu Dhabi, was acting as head of a security working party functioning within the larger framework created during the Istanbul talks, and was negotiating with the Ukrainians as Medinsky's subordinate. Anyway, this is what the Russians are saying. And it's not just Medinsky who's going to Geneva. Amongst others who are going are other members of the Russian team who negotiated with the Ukrainians in the Istanbul talks last year. And the most important of these is Mikhail Galuzin, who is a deputy foreign minister. He is, in other words, an official of the Russian foreign ministry. He is answerable to Lavrov, and Galuzin, importantly, is the same Russian official who, as I discussed in my program yesterday, is now proposing that the moment has come to place Ukraine under some form of external trusteeship. The government in Kiev can no longer function properly. It is illegitimate and unconstitutional, and therefore someone from outside, maybe the United Nations, maybe someone else, Russia possibly, might have to take on the onerous task of administering Ukraine until legality is restored and elections are held. Now that, needless to say, is a view that is going to be not just unpopular, but completely unacceptable to the Ukrainians. And in fact, the Ukrainians are not happy about these changes in the makeup of the Russian team. The fact that the Russians are saying that the Istanbul talks have been revived, and this is a continuation of them, that the Ukrainians are going to be facing the same Russian delegation that they confronted in Istanbul in the summer, and that heading that delegation, that Russian delegation, will be Medinsky, Galuzin, and Kostyakov, exactly as was also the case in Istanbul. And it's unsurprising that the Ukrainians are unhappy, because in the autumn, just before Christmas, Ukrainian officials actually said that Ukraine was calling off the talks, was cancelling the talks in Istanbul, the ones that took place in the summer, that process had failed and was being ended because the Russians were refusing to agree to a ceasefire. So the Ukrainians have never agreed that the summer 2025 talks were a continuation of the 2022 talks, and they've tried to claim that the 2025 talks were cancelled as well. And now we see that the Russians are coming back and say, well, actually, they were never cancelled at all. They're now resuming in Geneva, and we're going to continue precisely from that point where we left off. And already you could see signs of Ukrainian nervousness. The Ukrainian party, the delegation that the Ukrainians are sending to the talks, which is identical, by the way, to the one that the Ukrainians previously sent to the talks in Abu Dhabi, and continues to be headed by Rustem Umerov and Kirill Budanov. Anyway, they left Kiev by train, and before leaving by train, Budanov quipped that the Ukrainians are going to reacquaint themselves with history. And of course, that is a reference to the fact that the head of the Russian delegation, Russia's chief negotiator, Vladimir Medinsky, is a historian, an actual professional historian, and that he does, in fact, regularly, amongst other things, read out what are in effect history lectures which the Ukrainians find very uncomfortable. He reads them out, lectures of that kind, over the course of the negotiations. The Ukrainians, as I discussed in my program yesterday, loathe Medinsky. So do the Europeans. Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, who, by the way, has now told us that he spends much of his time communing with his dog. Well, there are worse people to speak to, I suppose. Anyway, Mark Rutte has previously mocked Medinsky precisely because he is a historian. But once again, the Ukrainians, who don't like Medinsky, who find him very hardline, who consider him a Russian nationalist. Medinsky, by the way, was born in Ukraine and has made it fairly clear that as far as he is concerned, Ukraine basically is a part of the Russian world. Anyway, the Ukrainians don't like meeting with Medinsky. He makes them very, very uncomfortable. And, well, they have to go because the Americans are insisting on it. And as for the Americans, I'm going to make a further observation that Witkoff and Kushner are now going to experience a Russian negotiating team of a kind that they have not had to work with before. Previously, their interactions have either been with Putin himself, which have been long and friendly conversations, or they've been bystanders as the Russians and the Ukrainians, Kostyakov and Umerov, the security officials, talk about dirty wars and buffer zones and that kind of thing. Now they're going to find themselves in the same room as a group of professional Russian negotiators, people who care massively about detail and who are very deeply instructed on the detail, people who can be expected to have all their facts at their fingertips and who will go through things line by line. And how Witkoff, Kushner and co are going to respond to all of that, I cannot say. Witkoff and Kushner are much more happy dealing with business people. Dmitriev is also going to be there in Geneva, but the Russians have made it clear that he is not participating in the negotiations. Dmitriev is not going to be involved in the negotiations relating to Ukraine. He's going to be talking to Witkoff about potential future economic cooperation, something which, by the way, everybody knows is never going to happen. Anyway, so this is how the talks in Geneva are now being set up. So why has this happened? Why are the Russians suddenly announcing this major upgrade of their negotiating team, something which the Ukrainians did not expect, and I suspect the Americans did not expect either? Now, there are two schools of thought here. One, which is represented, for example, by people like John Helmer, argue that the Russians are about to capitulate. They're going to give up, to give way to all of the US demands. They're going to agree to a ceasefire on the existing conflict lines. They're going to agree to all of those things, and they're going to do it because they want the sanctions that have been imposed upon themselves lifted. Well, I have great respect for John Helmer and his analysis, but on this occasion, I think he is wrong. I don't get any sign, any sense at all that the Russians are coming to Geneva in any mood to give ground or to compromise. Quite the opposite, actually. And it is worth bearing in mind that as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, Medinsky is absolutely, emphatically a hardliner. He was the person, after all, who at one of the sessions last summer in Istanbul told the Ukrainians it's high time you backed down and gave up, because if you don't be in any doubt, Peter the Great took 20 plus years to win his war against Sweden. We are perfectly willing, if we must, to keep going for every bit as long in order to achieve our objectives against you in Ukraine. So there's nothing about Medinsky that suggests to me that he's been sent as a person who's going to capitulate. He is, of course, very close to Putin. He is Putin's aide, and Peskov, Putin's spokesman, said that Medinsky, throughout the discussions in Geneva, is going to be in close contact with Putin, who will, of course, be in Moscow. But Peskov also said something else. He said that the earlier meetings, the meetings in Abu Dhabi, were about security issues, dirty wars and all that kind of thing, and buffer zones and all that kind of thing. The reason this meeting is going to be held in this expanded format on the Russian side is because the Russians intend to bring up every topic. They're not going to just talk security and buffer zones and dirty wars and forms of engagement. They're going to discuss the political issues. Territory, obviously, but not just territory. They want to discuss the status of the Russian Orthodox Church, the rights of Russians in Ukraine, the issue of NATO and the fact that Ukraine cannot join NATO. They will undoubtedly want to discuss very forcefully, one assumes, the whole question of security guarantees for Ukraine. The Russians have repeatedly complained over the last few weeks that they are reading in the media in the West about all sorts of promises that the United States has made to Ukraine about security guarantees and about a document supposedly negotiated by the Americans and the Ukrainians about security guarantees, which the Ukrainians and the Americans, however, have not yet signed. The Russians complain that they have not been shown this document, that they have made it very clear that they don't like anything that they hear about it. So what the Russians are going to do is that they're going to come to Geneva tomorrow and they're going to demand answers. They're going to demand answers about the security guarantees. They will insist that the document that has been talked about is provided. They will want to see this document. They will want opportunities to criticize it and to take it apart. They will hit the Ukrainians and, by the way, the Americans with everything on every subject. They will go over it in detail and they will demand answers and they will demand concessions as well. And that is what I think the Russians are going to do. But the reason why I think they are doing it goes back to what I said at the start of this program. I think that the Russians are sensing that over the next few weeks or months, there is going to be a radical shift in the situation on the front lines. The fact that the Russians have broken into Konstantinovka, the center of Konstantinovka, the fact that Ukraine's Zaporozhye offensive is running out of steam, the fact that the Russians continue to press Orechov, the fact that the Russians are making further progress in the northern parts of Donbas, the fact that another massive Russian strike is coming, and that Ukraine's entire energy system is on the brink of collapse. What that is telling the Russians is that the issue of Donbas, the so-called territorial issue, is not going to remain a key topic for discussion for very, very much longer. Because as Putin hinted in a meeting he had with his generals at the end of last year, this issue is about to take care of itself. Within the next few months, the Russians will have captured Donbas. They will soon be in a position where they can launch an attack on Zaporozhye city itself, and perhaps even take it before the end of the year, perhaps even sooner than that. At which case, the territorial issue, as we have known it, is no longer going to apply. And then, in light of that, discussions on security issues and things of that kind connected to a Ukrainian withdrawal from Donbas become redundant, and we move decisively into the area of high politics and of political demands over NATO, rights of Russian speakers, rights for the Russian Orthodox Church, disarmament of Ukraine, and coming back to what Galuzin was talking about yesterday, perhaps some form of trusteeship for Ukraine, regime change, in other words, by stealth. So that is why I think the Russians have upgraded their negotiating team. Certainly, it's something which the Ukrainians don't seem to be happy about. I get the sense that the Americans were surprised by it, but perhaps don't fully understand its significance. The US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, mentioned that there were about to be talks in Geneva and that the Russians seem to be changing the format of their team, but I don't think he understood how much the team was in fact being upgraded. And as I said, I think that we're going to have a very, very tough negotiation tomorrow. Now, further reasons to think that is the rather pessimistic way, in fact, the very pessimistic way, that the negotiations in Geneva are being covered in the British media. There's a long article today in The Guardian, which clearly derives from Ukrainian sources, which say that the Russians are not going to budge on their supposedly maximalist demands, and that the Ukrainians don't expect to have an easy time of it in Geneva tomorrow. Now, just to quickly say on that point, the demands the Russians have made up to now cannot, in my opinion, be described as maximalist. Istanbul Plus falls well short of what maximalist demands would be. But I noticed that today, on Sonar 21, his invaluable Substack blog, Larry Johnson has written a piece pointing out how flexible the expression Novorossiya, which the Russians are again increasingly using, can be how Novorossiya at various times has had different geographical meanings. That in the past it has extended to include places like Kharkiv in the north and Nikolaev and Odessa in the southwest, and that the way in which the Russians are now talking all the time, again, about Novorossiya, might indeed suggest that before long, after the fall of Donbas, maybe, as the negotiations continue, the Russians might up their demands and say that Novorossiya includes all of these other places, Kharkiv, Odessa, Nikolaev, as well as the four regions, and that they must also ultimately be transferred to Russia. I think we are still a certain way from that, but I think Larry Johnson is probably right that it is indeed the direction of travel. Anyway, there it is, an interesting developments about the negotiations in Geneva. To repeat again, the Ukrainians don't seem to be happy at all. This has all come suddenly, and by the way, with the Russians, it often does. We'll see what happens when the two delegations, rather I should say the three delegations, meet together in Geneva tomorrow and on Wednesday. Now, in the meantime, and just finishing on these topics, there's been a very interesting article by Sergei Poletayev, who I'm coming to the view is one of the most intelligent and insightful military commentators about the conflict in Ukraine on the Russian side. And he has provided what I think is the single most detailed and intelligent analysis of the energy war, the electricity war that the Russians are waging against Ukraine that anybody has provided up to now. And Poletayev's point is that what the Russians are trying to do is basically collapse the entire industrial energy system created by the Soviet Union, which has proved such an enormous asset for Ukraine and which has been the backbone of Ukraine's economy. And he makes the point, and it's an absolutely correct point, that there is no way of completely depriving a modern nation of electric power. There will always be some electric power generated in Ukraine. But the kind of campaign that the Russians are conducting, closing down destroying the thermal power stations, the big thermal power stations, knocking up the electricity substations that transfer the electric power from the nuclear power plants to the energy grid. Something which, as he also points out, forces the nuclear power plants to reduce their energy output. And nuclear power plants are one of those machines that only work well when they are working at peak capacity. And if their power output is reduced, that can actually damage them in the long term. Anyway, what the Russians are trying to do is to isolate the nuclear power stations, break the energy system, and though there will continue to be some electric power, it will make industrial activity across Ukraine, which must already be beyond difficult, entirely impossible. It will end the entire railway system. It will, as he puts it, throw Ukraine in energy terms back to the 19th century. And Boletayev makes the point that a country without industrial quantities of electric power can no longer be considered an industrial country. And if it is pitched in a war against a country that absolutely is an industrial power, which of course Russia is, then it cannot sustain itself and win that kind of war. It becomes impossible. And I think on all of this, he is right. Now this, it seems to me, does fit very well with John Helmer's analysis back in 2022 at the start of the electricity war, which is that those earlier attacks in 2022, 2023, and later were preparatory to the major knockout blow that the Russians would launch against the power system when the big offensive finally came. And that links up to all that I've been saying earlier in this program, because it does seem to me that that big offensive increasingly looks like it's about to come. You can see that the Russians have all the pieces on the board where they needed to be. They often talk about conducting war rhythmically. Putin uses this expression all the time, that this is a rhythmic approach to the war. In other words, you arrange so that everything, not just one thing, but everything is in place in the right way when you need it to be. It may take you time to get there, but they are now almost there. Probably all that is holding them back at the moment is the weather, the fact that we're still in winter, and then the spring thaw. But come late spring, events are going to start to come together, and we can see that the Russians are now positioned diplomatically, economically, industrially, on the battlefields, all at the same time as well. Anyway, that's my reading of the situation at the moment. We will see how things turn out. But anyway, I would be very, very interested to be on a fly in the wall at the meetings in Geneva tomorrow and on Wednesday. Though, of course, I can't be. And to repeat again, as to its actual plans, the Russian General Staff tell us very little. And we have to try and work out what's going to happen to a certain extent from hints that they occasionally drop and directions that give us a sense of where things might be happening. Now, of course, Ukraine is not the only conflict in the world. And I'm now going to return to the topic of Marco Rubio's speech in Munich. Now, this was received rapturously by the Europeans. They're all worried that they were going to have another speech from J.D. Vance, or that they were going to have a speech like the one they got from J.D. Vance, which, by the way, I think they grossly overreacted to, but a speech that would be critical of them. Now, what actually happened was, what they got from Rubio was a speech which was actually very critical of them. It made all the same points that J.D. Vance made last year. Wolfgang Munchau, in an article in Unheard, has made that very same point. Rubio talks about out of control in immigration, deindustrialization, hollowing out of industries, demoralization of society, increasing repression, censorship, all of those things. He talks a lot about all of these things in his speech, exactly in the way that J.D. Vance also did. But it all comes with big spoonfuls of sugar about how the United States was born out of Europe, how it carries the banner of European civilization, how it is European to its core, all of those things, and how Europe and the United States are part of a single cultural space, which is, of course, the West. And, of course, the Europeans loved all of that, as they always do. They always like to be told that in civilizational terms, they are at the center of humanity. They are, in fact, the vanguard of humanity, which is, by the way, pretty much what Rubio also said. So we had a lot of that in the speech, but we also had something else, and what we got, I thought, was pretty disturbing, actually. Now, Rubio has a reputation as a neocon. He also has a reputation. He also had a reputation as being very, very hostile to China. He was actually asked about that, and by the way, he basically didn't deny it. He said, yeah, China's a big country, we're a big country, we need to speak and all of that, but he never really denied or repudiated any of the things about China that he has said in the past. But anyway, some people are saying that this was a neocon speech spoken by a prominent neocon who is updating neocon doctrines for the MAGA world. Well, I think there is a fair amount of that there, but reading the speech through, I think that actually understates what Rubio said, because if you read it through carefully, yes, he talks about freedom, he talks about all of those things that the Americans love to talk about, but it was in fact an unabashed, unqualified praise of the doctrine of power. It's all about power. Everything ultimately revolves around power. Institutions, the United Nations, all of those things, they're there basically to be controlled, and they're to be controlled in service of Western interests. And Western interests at this particular point in time are American interests. Rubio talked a lot about the decline of the West. He didn't actually deny that it is happening. He said that it was the purpose of the United States, however, under the current administration, to reverse that decline. This is US policy now. And in order to reverse that decline, the United States is going to ruthlessly use the enormous power it still has in order to re-establish or establish its primacy and that of the West. And the job, the function of the Europeans is to support this project, to support, in other words, the project of American power. If Rubio wants the Europeans to become stronger, and he did talk a lot about that, he talked about how because of uncontrolled immigration and deindustrialization and all of these other various processes, European society is becoming incoherent and European will is weaker, and the Europeans' ability to promote themselves is reducing. Rubio wanted them to take steps to end all of that, to stop immigration, mass immigration, to reindustrialize, to do all of those things so that they could be stronger, but stronger so that they can be more useful allies to the United States, which would like to have them as it fights the forces of decline and seeks to perpetuate and even extend its own power. Rubio even said at one point that the United States, if it must, if it has to, will go it alone. It would prefer its European allies to be there with it, but ultimately it is the boss, it is in charge, and the only job the Europeans have is to defend themselves first, so that the Americans don't have to rescue them. And it's not difficult to guess who they have to defend themselves from. Obviously, it is the Russians. And also to support the United States in its various other conflicts, against China, in the Middle East, wherever. Now, this isn't an alliance anymore. The Europeans are no longer going to be treated as allies. At best, they are loyal janissaries of the Sultan being, of course, the United States. The janissaries, for those who don't know, were formidable warriors who fought for the Ottoman Sultan in the 15th and 16th century. But they were, even as they were perhaps the best fighters in the world at that time, they were also literally his slaves. And that, it seems to me, is the position that Marco Rubio and the people who are around him, that's what they want for the Europeans at this time. They want them to be willing warrior slaves of the United States. And I noticed, interestingly, that he offered them nothing in return. There was no suggestion that the United States would really be giving anything back to the Europeans in return for this service. About Ukraine, as many people pointed out, he had very little actually to say. He talked about the fact that there were negotiations taking place, that the United States is leading in those negotiations. He said that the negotiations were very difficult, that the issues in dispute had been narrowed, but they had been narrowed to the most intractable. He said that the trick was to find a deal that would be acceptable to Ukraine, but which the Russians would support as well. Of course, the two exclude each other. There is no possible way that with the present government in Kiev that will ever happen. But the overwhelming sense I got is that as far as Rubio is concerned, and I suspect this reflects a wider view within the administration, Ukraine now is essentially a European problem. The Americans are going to do what they can to stop it, because it's a major drain on their resources, and they obviously don't want an outright Russian victory in Ukraine. But in the end, it's not a conflict that they lose sleep over. They have far more urgent things to prioritize and worry about against Iran in the Middle East, against China in Asia, in the Western Hemisphere, where they're now busy tightening their control. And of course, consequent upon that, Rubio skipped the meeting of the group at the Munich Security Conference that was supposed to talk about Ukraine. One European official complained that this was madness and that nothing would be decided without the Americans there. He was right, by the way. And anyway, that was the message. You in Europe may care about Ukraine. It may be the first issue of importance and priority for you. We don't say we don't care about it at all, but we, the United States, have other still more important things to worry about. I have to say, I have never ever seen a speech by a US Secretary of State that was quite like this. Some of the sentiments expressed are not out of line with the sort of things that were said during the George W. Bush, Dick Cheney era. I mean, at that time, those two were also pretty unembarrassed about the fact that the United States was an empire and that they were leading it. But Rubio took it a whole stage further, and I get to say straight away that I don't think actually it matches real MAGA thinking at all. Now, even as all of this is going on, the United States continues to assemble an enormously powerful strike force against Iran. The Iranians are still making it absolutely clear that they're not prepared to make any of the fundamental concessions that the Americans demand of them on nuclear enrichment, on the range of their ballistic missiles, on Iran's support for its regional allies. For the Iranians, agreeing to these things would be not just a betrayal of their friends, but it would amount to a total loss of sovereignty. So we are definitely heading towards a potential clash in the Middle East. In fact, the latest reports say that Israel is now again going back on the agreement that it made with Iran in December. Israel is again now debating launching a preemptive strike against Iran in order to impress the Americans and to provide some kind of opening for the war, which the Americans can then join. So the war drums in the Middle East are beating very loud, and I personally have no doubt at all that we're going to see a major battle play out there very soon. And the word is that it's going to continue for weeks, perhaps even months. At least that's the American intention. And there's no serious doubt on anybody's part that the objective in Iran is regime change, though there is still a lack of clarity as to how exactly that is going to be brought about and what the consequences of achieving it would actually be. But anyway, all of this activity around Iran coming together with Rubio's speech and with the realities of the situation in Ukraine, which have been revealed many times, the US's inability to match Russian levels of weapons production, the US inability to help Ukraine to win its battles against Russia, the offensive that the Americans micromanaged in Ukraine, the 2023 counteroffensive, was a complete disaster. This rhetoric from Rubio would make sense if the United States really was in a position to reverse its own and the West's relative decline. But frankly, I don't think it is. If it has failed in Ukraine, what are the chances that it is going to succeed consistently anywhere else? Perhaps it might succeed in Iran. I've said that this to me looks to be mostly conditional on the stability of the country itself. But I can very easily see how this goes wrong, how this could go wrong, how a war, a campaign which the Americans might think will go on for weeks and months, might go on for much longer than they imagine. After all, it's widely acknowledged that when the Israeli army entered Gaza in October 2023, with the full support and a blank check from the then US President Joe Biden, the Israelis expected that the fighting in Gaza would be over within 2 or 3 months, I believe. Well, it has never really been resolved, and the objectives that the Israelis set themselves militarily have never been fully achieved either. Hamas is still there. It still carries arms to this day. It is still the force which has political control of Gaza. So that turned out to be a much longer war than the Israelis reckoned. What if Iran turns out the same? What if American expectations that this war will last 3 weeks, perhaps a month, perhaps 2, turn out to be wrong? What if in 2, 3, 4, 5 months it is still ongoing? What if the Straits of Hormuz get closed? What if American soldiers start to get killed? What then? Now, I've seen opinion polls from the United States, and the thing that immediately struck me is the difference with the situation in 2002 and 2003 ahead of the American invasion of Iraq. At that time, as I remember, over 70% of Americans polled said that they supported the invasion. Today, significantly fewer than half do. Support, by that I mean an attack on Iran. Significantly fewer than half today support an attack on Iran. The base of support for a war against Iran is much smaller than was the case when the United States attacked Iraq 20 years ago. The war in Iran quickly came to be seen as a failure in the United States. It has caused a groundswell of anger and opposition within American society and within the American military. And one of the key reasons why Donald Trump became president of the United States in the first place was because he said that the war had been a mistake and that nothing like that was ever going to happen again. Well, if this war against Iran turns out to be a debacle, how much more politically worse will it be, given that support for the war in the first place is so much lower? Of course, if things go especially wrong, if there is no regime change and the Straits of Hormuz are closed and the Ayatollah and his successors still retain control and the process of BRICS integration accelerates, then this whole pitch that Marco Rubio made about the United States acting to reverse the decline of the West will be exposed as a total absurdity. Possibly back in the 1940s, the United States might have had the power to do the sort of things that Marco Rubio wants it to do today. At that time, it was economically, industrially, militarily, far and away the strongest power in the world. Today, it faces two other great powers. Russia, which has a nuclear arsenal greater than its own and an advanced technology, and which is self-sufficient in energy and food, and has powerful armed forces. And it's up against China, another superpower, which is all of the strengths that Russia has, but added to them the fact that it has by far the biggest manufacturing and industrial base in the world. And there are many other centers of power around the world in a way that it was not true in the 1940s. Sooner or later, this project that Rubio is talking about, if it is ever really embraced, is going to fail. It is going to fail disastrously. It is going to fail in the United States. It is going to fail in the world. It might achieve the odd limited win, but whatever wins it gets will be ephemeral, and they will probably undermine, ultimately, the whole project. This is, in fact, emphatically not going to work. As I discussed in recent programs, there are increasing signs now that the Russians and the Chinese are working together, not just to defend each other and themselves, but to start providing aid to other countries around the world that are finding themselves under this kind of pressure. I've discussed in recent programs the help that these two powers are giving to Iran and the help that these two powers are trying to give to Cuba. Inevitably, if the United States starts to do what Marco Rubio is doing, this resistance from China and Russia will grow. And not only that, but sooner or later, it is all going to end in a smash. And assuming that we avoid any of the greater disasters, well, following that smash, I wonder what the political position and the global position of the United States will look like. The United States could absorb a defeat of the scale of Vietnam in the 1960s. It cannot do so today. Anyway, I'm going to finish this program by simply mentioning that Marco Rubio, over the course not so much of the speech but of the Q&A that came after it, might have provided a hint as to what is actually happening on this vexed subject of India's imports of Russian oil. He was asked about that, and over the course of his answer, he gave a rather interesting reply. And perhaps at this point, it's worth saying that Rubio is a lawyer and somebody who obviously chooses his words carefully. It's possible that this was not something one should overanalyze and perhaps place too much on. But this is what he said about India. In our conversations with India, we've gotten their commitment to stop buying additional Russian oil. So this is a verbal commitment. There's obviously nothing in writing. And they said we've gotten their commitment to stop buying additional Russian oil. It's the word additional that intrigues me. Does he mean additional Russian oil over and above the oil which Russia has already supplied? Just say. So far, there's no evidence that this is the case. Perhaps such a commitment was made. Or could it be that the Indians said that they would not buy oil from Russia additional to the oil that they are buying already? In other words, that they're not going to increase the volumes of oil that they buy from the Russians above those that they already do. I say that India, by the way, has just published, I understand, another deal with Russia to buy S-400 interceptors for their air defense system. So the sense I'm getting is that India, at least, still prizes its relationship with Moscow. Anyway, I regard the word additional as interesting. I wonder whether the Americans and the Indians did use it over the course of their discussions, each giving to that word a different meaning. Maybe there was a quiet understanding that this is what should be done in order to get round this. Who's to say? We'll see how it plays out in the next few weeks. But anyway, this is how I'm going to finish my program today. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Please remember also to check out our Substack site. Last but not least, please also remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.